to Ship, Sea and the Stars, the weekly webcast from Royal Museums Greenwich. We're here every week with stories of the space, sea, history and creativity with Royal Museums Greenwich curators and special guests. And if you'd like to get in contact with us, we would love to hear from you. So please look for Royal Museums Greenwich on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter. So you can ask for topics we might cover in the future or any questions that you've got relating to what we're going to discuss today. And what we are going to discuss today is the topic of being stranded at sea. We often use the saying, out of sight, out of mind. And one of the things that the early days of lockdown really brought to the fore is one of those things that was out of sight and out of mind. And that is the vast supply chains that cover our oceans, the ships, the international cargo that we rely on for food and medicine and consumer goods, and also the people that are on those ships. And they were obviously critical in keeping everyone alive during all of this, keeping all those supply chains going. However, the consequences have been that hundreds of thousands of seafarers have effectively been stranded at sea because of the restrictions that COVID has brought. And so, although this isn't a new phenomenon, you know, it's been common throughout history. And so, of course, we've got some historical context to add to the modern day stories. And so we're going to be talking about all of that today. We've got three fascinating guests to guide us through isolation at sea, past and present. And they are Hannah Stockton, who is the curator of the Cutty Sark, Branko Berlan, who's the representative at the International Maritime Organization of the International Transport Workers Federation. And we have the Reverend Dennis Woodward, who's the chaplain mission for seafarers. So he's a chaplain who goes out talking. Well, I'm going to let you introduce yourself. Why don't you tell us your connection, Dennis? Let's start with you. Tell us something about your connection to this topic.
Yeah, so as I'm chaplain to the Port of Rotterdam. Port of Rotterdam is still Europe's biggest port. And I work for a Christian charity called Mission to Seafarers, a global charity. And currently in my role as port chaplain, I visit many merchant vessels here in the Port of Rotterdam. There are over 100 seagoing vessel movements per day. I don't visit 100 ships per day. That would be lovely. But I visit a tiny amount of those, and I try and support seafarers where I can, caring for them spiritually, mentally. There's different needs at the moment, especially during COVID. So try and support seafarers as best as I can.
Fabulous. Hannah, how about you?
As you said, I'm one of the curators of the Cutty Sark at the Maritime Museum. So I've always had a particular interest in the lives of seafarers. I think the ship is one of the most kind of immediate ways we have to kind of understand the lives of seafarers in the past. So yeah, that's the angle I'm coming from.
Brilliant. And last but not least, Branko.
Yeah, I'm a seafarer actually, and I've been on sea for 17 years. However, the last 7 years, I work and represent the ITF in the IMO, and in general, we are the only or a major representative of the labor and the seafarers at this UN agency. So last 7 years, we've been talking about the safety of the ships, but major issue for us is always the safety of the humans on board as ships, so the seafarers and the others. So that's my background.
Fabulous. Okay, we're going to set the scene this week with an excerpt from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And if you know the story, you will know that it starts with a captain going out to the Arctic to explore, and he's writing letters back to his sister Margaret. So this is before any of the stuff with Victor Frankenstein, this monster gets going. But here's an excerpt describing his thoughts, what he's writing back to his sister as he sets out on this voyage to the Arctic, and it's read by Simon Kane.
I have hired a vessel and am occupied in collecting my sailors. Those whom I have already engaged appear to be men on whom I can depend and are certainly possessed of dauntless courage. But I have one want, which I have never yet been able to satisfy, and the absence of the object of which I now feel as a most severe evil. I have no friend, Margaret. When I am glowing with the enthusiasm of success, there will be none to participate my joy. If I am assailed by disappointment, no one will endeavour to sustain me in dejection. I shall commit my thoughts to paper, it is true, but that is a poor medium for the communication of feeling. I desire the company of a man who could sympathize with me, whose eyes could reply to mine. You may deem me romantic, my dear sister, but I bitterly feel the want of a friend. I have no one near me, gentle yet courageous, possessed of a cultivated as well as of a capacious mind, whose tastes are like my own, to approve or amend my plans. How would such a friend repair the faults of your poor brother? Well, these are useless complaints. I shall certainly find no friend on the wide ocean, nor even here in Archangel among merchants and seamen.
So I find that a striking passage because it really brings out, I mean, he's not painting a happy human picture here, but he went anyway. And the thing, and I know this, you know, from having spent time at sea, that, you know, there are compromises, but you go anyway. And that is the striking thing to me. How about reactions from the rest of you? Perhaps let's start with Hannah.
I think for me, what stood out is partly in kind of preparing for this. I was reading through an account we had of an apprentice on a very long voyage, and the captain eventually commits suicide, but really seemed to struggle with his mental health before that happened. And there's so many parallels, and I think the way the captain in the passage talks about not feeling like he could communicate with his crew, and because he's not completely alone on the ship, but that he feels that way. And this is an idea that's brought up by this apprentice as well. He talks about how he felt like the captain, that they were powerless to assist him with his kind of internal struggles. And I think that's really a kind of parallel that stood out to me.
Thank you. Branko, how about you?
Yeah, a very popular word now is self-isolation. And I think that the seafarers know very well what it's self-isolation anyhow. I mean, normally it's happening. And now we're talking about these civilians, like people on shore, talking about self-isolation and the mental health of them. How could you imagine the situation about the seafarers who are now planning to stay a couple of months and then have to stay for a year on board the ships? Like in this story, probably they stay on board the ships for a couple of years.
So it
So
becomes trapped on board almost.
Yeah. This is something really rude to say about. Yeah, they are actually always self-isolated on board the ship with a new family, so to speak, but still.
But maybe not enough. Dennis, how about you? What did you take from that passage?
Yeah, maybe just a big amen to that. But just going on from that sentence, sort of no friend on the ocean, where yes, their crew, their fellow crew members, that's your family on board. But, and I'll say a bit more about this later on, but those lifelines back home are so key to continue to have that contact, not to get to a dark mental place, if you like. And absolutely, if you planned initially that you'd be on board for maybe a 6-7 month contract, and during COVID that suddenly doubled, it is like you're doing a double marathon. And so that's really, really hard. And so where's that friend at sea, if you like?
And it's very, you know, the way it works at sea is anyone who's spent time in that kind of environment knows there's a difference between people and a friend. And what you want is people like you. And it only takes one or two in that environment. I'm sure Branko's seen this, that you only need one or two people who kind of get you, and it's all right. But if you don't have that, you are so impoverished. Okay, well, let's get started on the objects that our guests have brought for us this week. And we're going to start with a seafarer's home at sea, which is a ship. So Hannah, introduce your object to us.
My first object is the Cutty Sark itself, which is the largest object in the Maritime Museum's collections, perhaps unsurprisingly. And she, as you say, spent a lot of time at sea and was a home to, I think we calculated over 600 crew members in that time, probably more as well.
So that's not all at the same time, right?
Not all at the same time. The crew, under the circumstances we'll be discussing, was probably between sort of 25, 30-ish. And
how long would a voyage last? How long would they be at sea for?
the difficulties of a sailing ship are that can be quite unpredictable. If you have perfect conditions, the contracts they were signing were for roughly a year. But there's also a very large clause in those contracts that says, but if it extends to 2 years, you don't really have a right to complain, essentially. So many things that were kind of fairly standard on a sailing ship could lengthen your voyage, but then you get kind of, as I think we'll discuss, so many things could go wrong that would delay that voyage. But even on a sailing ship, a bit of delay was standard, because if there's no wind, you can't sail, you just won't go anywhere. So you do hear a lot of frustration about becalming.
And how did expectation affect the way people felt trapped? Because, you know, we can see that obviously if you'll think you're going for a year and then you're told it's going to be another year, that's one thing. But presumably at the time when people went to sea, you know, there was very little expectation of contacting your family. You just kind of went, and everyone was glad if you came back. Was that the expectation, or were they a bit more demanding in terms of, you know, how nice it was for them?
They certainly do complain when these voyages go on. I've seen examples of voyages that were supposed to be a year and go on for 4 years. You were pretty much kind of at the mercy of both the weather, but also of both the captain and the owner of the ship, because he could extend the voyage if he felt you hadn't earned enough money on your first. So like if prices had changed while you were at sea, you'd arrive and find that they felt they hadn't earned enough money, so you'd have to do a couple of extra trips. But they do complain about that. On the voyage I've been reading about, the apprentice talks about his crewmate, who says that means another year before we make home port, even if we're lucky. And he described that his friend was clearly homesick and that his first voyage was becoming interminable. So they certainly did complain about these voyages getting that long. They would have been able to possibly write letters home if they had the money and if they were in port. They probably were maybe in port more than voyages might be nowadays, because the ports were a bit more central in. So they may have had
were a bit more human back in those days.
They tended to be sort of, particularly for sailing ships,
very sort of like factories almost. There's, you know, automated everything. And so how did they cope with being isolated at sea? What is there much record of what they did, or whether they just all were miserable? How did that work?
We have letters, we have journals from this period. There does seem to be the voyage in particular I've been looking at did descend into violence fairly often. I won't say that that's the only, and there was reported quite a lot of drinking. I'm not going to say that's the only way people coped, but that does seem to be something that some crew members have turned to. Possibly writing letters home. We do have letters from Cutty Sark crew members. Making these friendships, as you say, if you've got anybody on the crew that you can kind of associate with, and kind of you can, particularly with your watchmates, because they'll be on the same shift as you. There'll be other people you might not see that often because they're on an opposing watch.
So we should maybe just talk about that a little bit, and because it's not just you're on a ship, it's that you're on a ship with a very specific list of things to do. Here are your watches. You are going to be on deck at this time. You are going to do this job, and there's no debate about this. There's no days off. This is your watch. Deal with it. It's a really regimented life, isn't it?
Yeah, and actually, I think in some senses, this apprentice, at least, and he is an apprentice, so he's kind of chosen to be there, and maybe more than others have, but he says when the weather was good and when they were sailing well, he says, in spite of all the squabbles between officers and men, everyone seemed keen to make the best of the run and enjoy the excitement. So he certainly feels a lot more pressure when there's no wind, when there's not much they can do. They lose those duties, they've not got anything to focus on anymore. And that really seems to, there's another occasion where they were delayed in port for 2 months, I think, waiting for a cargo. And they say the same thing. They lost they didn't know what to do, because suddenly they didn't have these regimented duties to do. Not that they aren't physically exhausting, they are, and they're losing a lot of sleep in doing this, but they seem to really, the tension amongst the crew certainly seems to build when there aren't these regimented duties to focus on.
Well, I'm sure the stress of having nothing to do will be familiar to at least some people during lockdown who've been on land. But let's move forward into the modern day at sea, because there are thousands of ships at sea all over the world, and they still have people on board, even if it's perhaps not quite as many even as the Cutty Sark. So let's have a look at Branco's first object, which is the red ensign. So tell us just a little bit about this and the Merchant Navy, Branco.
Right, Merchant Navy, the number of the ships. I mean, I will go with the figures if I may. The figures are actually, there are 54,000 merchant ships in the world, which is a huge number. And it's, I don't know, the audience understand how big they are. It's a 52 million deadweights, which is about 40 million gross tonnage. So 80% of the world trade actually is made by the sea, or more than that, and there is many of those who are actually are very big ship owners countries, like UK. It is one of 10 on the top, and it's about, just to see the figure, 30 million gross tonnage. Maybe for the audience, it's also interesting to say that the value of the ships are more than $40 billion.
They're massive floating, warehouses, really. But how many people are on board a modern cargo ship?
Normal crew is around 20. Normal number of the crew is around 20 now. And we don't have to go that deep in history, like back to the Cutty Sark, to see a huge difference. Even 20 years ago, when I was in sea, it was more or less normal to be 7 months to 1 year. Now, but it's because of the trade and the actually recognition of the fatigue and safety of the crew, they reduced the period of or agreements in it, period of time to spend on board the ship. So many of those working on the offshore industry are working for a couple of weeks. Some of them are actually, or normally are on 3 months period on containers and the LNGs, which are the gas tankers. So 3 months on board a ship. It's not because it is this question of the commercial issue. It's a question of the safety, because the trade it's faster, and the time that it's been spent in the port are lower than usual. Like, for example, an LNG, liquefied natural gas tanker, spending 1 day in the port, then 15-20 days on the way to another port, and then 1 day there. So there is no free time for a seafarer.
So there's very little, so it's a very short period of time on land then. But so we've painted this picture of, back in February, perhaps of this year, there's these thousands of ships, they're moving all over the world, they're mostly at sea, they pop into a port, they straight out again. How did COVID change all of that? What happened in March and April?
Yeah, in your introduction, you actually mentioned the situation in which they are coping now. And the situation is that many of them actually, and expectations been to be on board very strict, 3 months, then 3 months and 1 day mean a 1 day more. Now the situation is that they're spending 6 months on board the ship. And that is obviously a double. Although, as I said, 20 years ago, that was a normal period of time. But expectation, if it is 3 months, it has to be 3 months. Could be 1 day less or 1 day more, and that's it. So the mental issue is very important in this.
And why, just very briefly, why is that happened? Because there were suddenly restrictions that people couldn't travel home from a port, and also the restrictions on which ships can come into ports. Why is it that they're stuck?
The issue is actually that the national governments didn't follow the situation with these. And at the beginning of the COVID in February or in March this year, actually, what they've tried to facilitate is only trade. And that's it. Not that many of them think about it, that there are humans on board a ship. and they stop the possibility for changing the crew, disembarkation or whatever. They actually decide close the borders, close the airports, and they didn't think about it, but they open the ports. They facilitate the ports.
And so what happens if someone stays on a ship? I mean, presumably they still get paid. Does that always happen? How do contracts work? It sounds as though there's the potential for a lot of bad behavior here. How well have seafarers been treated?
Yes, you are right. There is always been a problem with that, because yes, some of the ship owners or companies actually use this situation and try to change the agreements, to reduce the wages, to find the solutions, but they never actually make the change of the crew. And in reality, they actually make an additional, put the pressure or burden to the seafarers, like give them another tasks which are not regularly been done before or something like that. So that's even worse than it seems. So like, it's not only the question of time. Sometimes it's also the question of the task that they reach on these works.
So we'll come back to this, but let's move on, because obviously that has enormous implications for, as Hannah said, you know, people's well-being, and not only their mental health, but also their physical health. And I guess when seafarers are isolated on ships, they are cut off from lots of forms of potential help. But in port, there are people like Dennis who can provide some support. So Dennis, let's see your first object and then tell us why it matters.
So as a first object, I've brought somewhat unusually a deodorant stick with me, which, yes, is helpful to use for myself. But I would say what I've been handing out in ports as I ship visit as a port chaplain here in the port of Rotterdam are many of those shaving kits, shaving foam, bath gel, things like that, which you and I would be really easy to go to a supermarket and pick those things up. For a seafarer in the middle of the ocean, those things aren't available. And so some of these hygiene products, and having a bag of those for a crew, as Branko said, which is, you know, often 20, maybe 25 on a 400-meter container vessel, something along those lines, and having these goodie bags for them, maybe add in a few chocolate bars, crisps, and just a thank you card, and saying, I think it's amazing what you guys do and the way you keep everything going at the times when we ask even more of you, basically, which we shouldn't, but we are. And so to have these things available is just a small token of appreciation and saying, look, what you do matters, and thank you.
So you just painted a picture of a chaplain as a sort of personal shopper, but there's a bit more to it than that. So just set the broader context. So Rotterdam is a massive port. I have sat in a ship just off Rotterdam, actually not a cargo port, and I had the number of ships that are going in and out of there, massive things. It's absolutely astonishing. So in your daily job, what do you do? You're at the port. What happens when a ship comes in? What do you do?
Yes, well, obviously a personal shopper. But besides that, I'm also a licensed priest. And so on occasion, I also take mass on board. I come across quite a number of Filipino seafarers who tend to be Roman Catholic. For me, it's not so much important, those of faith, those without faith, ages, gender, ethnicity, doesn't matter. I think at one point, we all hit a point where we're keen to ask certain questions and maybe just have someone with a listening ear. And so this is what we offer. And during Corona, this is at the moment really hard, because my ship visiting with face mask, with the right PPE, with disposable gloves is somewhat limited to the top of the gangway, which is that bit that goes sort of from shore to the top of the ship. And I'm allowed sort of also for my organization, but also with the Port of Rotterdam Authority, I can't really go inside. And so having that more one-on-one quality time is just not possible at the moment. And so I try and assess really quickly how people are doing. And just the other day really broke my heart. I was on board a chemical tanker, 21 crew, and 11 of the 21 were past 14 months on board.
Wow,
that is astonishing and way past contract. And like I mentioned earlier, it is sort of like you're running a double marathon. It's just physically, mentally so exhausting. And I've been working actually alongside the ITF, very grateful for their support and their help in trying to get seafarers home. And it's been really frustrating at times when you come up against national policies that is just really, really hard.
So is it basically just the case that, you know, these people are in a situation where effectively the law says they have to do this? And tiredness and depression sound perfectly natural, but how is there any escape for them or help? Like how do they deal with that mentally?
Yes, so I mean, we obviously try, and also via the port and other ways and online. I'm active on Twitter, Facebook. We try and advertise and get the word out that, hey, you know, there are chaplains like myself out here in this massive port. And you're right, there are 30,000 seagoing vessel movements per year in this port. And so it's easy to get lost, and it's easy to be stuck with maybe even during this time suicidal thoughts. And unfortunately, during Corona, quite a number of suicides have happened for people where the hope has really been dashed. And every death is one too many. And it's so sad when I read about that has happened. And so what we try and do is tie in with other organizations as well. ICE One has a brilliant seafarer helpline that can help seafarers if they're just keen to speak. Mission to Seafarers has Chat to a Chaplain, where you can contact us in multiple ways and just say, look, I just really struggle with this. I'm really homesick. I miss my family. And great, let's have a chat about that. And I'm so sorry what you're currently going through. Let's see how we can help. There are frustrating bits at times. When I know a certain ship will be sailing again, going to the other side of the world again, there is no imminent crew change happening, as Branko was telling us about. This is the daily reality for many seafarers still. I find that really frustrating. I have to be honest. That is challenging, but I keep going because I do find that there have been some very positive movements recently. And so I do really believe that eventually we can get all these seafarers back to their loved ones.
It does sound like, frankly, an astonishing act of cruelty. I mean, we know that our modern world depends on these ships getting around because every country isn't self-sufficient. But do you feel as though you're, complicit is the wrong word, but you look at the system that surrounds them and says, this whole system, there's something wrong here. Is there a sense of injustice? I mean, there must be around all of this.
I would go one step further and saying, I think the logistical system, the way it's currently wired, is broken. And I think, I've stopped ordering products from certain retailers just by the way it works. I think same day delivery is not helpful and puts additional pressure on seafarers, actually, because we were just talking about their very short or non-existent shore leave. That in part has to do with us as consumers wanting goods more quickly and faster turnaround times for ships. And so then as a consumer, you're also complicit in how you keep everything going. And so, yes, I do believe there's something that we have a voice as consumers. And so there's something currently in the system that's bust, in my opinion, definitely. There are still many, they're estimating between 250,000, 300,000 seafarers currently still stuck at sea, and an equal number in their country where the money has now run out and are keen to work, but they're unable to be sent out to their ship. And so
we'll come back to these issues. There's a huge amount to talk about here. For anyone who's just joining us, this is Ship, Sea and the Stars with Royal Museums Greenwich, and this week we're talking about people being stranded at sea with curator Hannah Stockton and also Branko Balan and the Reverend Dennis Woodward. Now we're going to start the second half with a poem from a collection that was published in 1790 by Charlie Dibdin, and it tells a story that was a popular trope at the time, conveying quite a common worry. The voice of the poem it's a sailor, and he's talking about his girlfriend Poll and his best friend Joe, and it's read by Simon Kane.
I was, d'ye see, a waterman as tight and spruce as any. Twixt Richmond town and Horsley down I turned an honest penny. None could of fortune's favours brag more than could lucky I. My cot was snug, well filled my cadge, my grunter in my sty. With wherry tight and bosom light I cheerfully did row. And to complete this princely life, sure never one had friend and wife like my Poll and my partner Joe. I rolled in joys like these a while, folks far and near caressed me, till woe is me, so lubbily the vermin came and pressed me. How could I all these pleasures leave? How with my wherry part? I never so took on to grieve, it wrung my very heart. But when on board they gave the word to foreign parts to go, I rued the moment I was born that I should ever thus be torn from my Poll and my partner Joe. I did my duty manfully while on the billows rolling, and night or day could find my way blindfold to the maintop bowling. Thus all the dangers of the main quicksands and gales of wind I braved in hopes to taste again the joys I left behind. In climes afar, when hottest war poured broadsides on the foe, I hoped these perils to relate, as by my side attentive sate my Poll and my partner Joe. At last, it pleased his Majesty to give peace to the nation, and honest hearts in foreign parts come home for consolation. Like lightning, for I felt new life, now safe from war's alarms, I returned, and found my friend and wife locked in each other's arms. Yet fancy not I bore this lot from him he lubber, no! For seeing I was finally tricked, plump to the devil I boldly kicked my Poll and my partner Joe.
So it perhaps is the seafarer's nightmare that they go away and they motivate themselves while they're at sea with these thoughts of telling stories to their best friends and their family when they're at home, and they get home and they find it's all gone wrong. Hannah, your next object perhaps has a slightly more cheerful story, but perhaps born of a similar fear. Tell us about this.
Yeah, so this is a kind of heart-shaped cushion. It's got lots of kind of beadwork, artificial flowers, and it's got a photo of what I'm informed is the HMS Bonaventure. And it's very, very difficult to see, but the blue beading on either side at the top reads "Think of Me." So it's a kind of, we know that this was donated to us by the son of the original gifter, who was George Ernest Cochrane. Who was born in London in 1879, and we know that he served in the Royal Marines between 1896 and 1909. And the photograph dates this to about 1907 to 1909, so right in kind of latter period of his service. And we know that he gifted it to his then fiancée Edith Mary Andrews, who he married in 1910 after he left the Marines.
So she did wait for him then.
She did.
Happy story.
Yes, and I believe they remained married for many, many years after that. So it is a happy story.
And is this quite common in the collections? You know, people leaving it's almost a sort of promise, you know, I will come back, don't forget me. There is this fear of being forgotten, isn't there?
I think we do have quite a lot of kind of a whole range of souvenirs, I suppose, or gifts made for family at home. Cutty Sark has a little box made by a crew member and given to a family member on their return. I think we even have a pair of underwear with the ship's name embroidered on it that have been, I think, from the 1980s. So there is a very wide range of these kind of gifts and souvenirs that are kind of given to family members at home to commemorate the voyage, but also to kind of strengthen that relationship, I suppose.
And it's very, you know, mentally very important, I guess, to keep in touch with people at home. So you were talking about potentially writing letters before. What evidence is there of people, you know, being desperate to keep in touch, and how much, because I have seen this at sea, that, you know, you live at sea, you're in your own little world basically, and it's sort of easier not to think about it because then it can't hurt. if you're not thinking about it. Do people really cling on, or do they just kind of shut their mind and go, right, well, I'm here now, I can't think about all of that?
It's a difficult one, I think. I suppose we as historians wouldn't have evidence of the kind of absence of letters, so it can be quite difficult. I'm sure journals, kind of individual journals, would go into more depth on that front. I think sometimes these gifts can be a way of doing that. You may, particularly back in the earlier periods we were talking about, the mail is really not reliable, certainly not when you're nipping from port to port. You may, sometimes the only mailing address they have is the office of the ship's agent in a port. So it's not always reliable that a letter might reach you there, or it might get there after you've already left. Or I think you couldn't, and certainly in those days, you could not rely on being able to be in contact with anyone at home.
It's a very tenuous connection. And I guess if you disappear, presumably everyone thought you were going for 6 months or a year, and then the voyage is extended for 2 years, they don't know whether you've fallen off the side or whether you're just in Australia.
They may not be informed. And people, for a lot of reasons, might have ended up staying in the port that they were last in. You might, if they'd gone out and committed an offence in some way, they often were left in jail. On that voyage I was talking about with Cutty Sark earlier, there were a number who were invalided to a hospital in Shanghai, so they didn't make it home, or certainly not on that ship anyway. So yes, it would have been a very kind of inconsistent and challenging. I think the communication with home, if it was able to happen at all, was quite challenging, and I think that's where some of these kind of souvenir objects come from. They kind of create a link. Even they may not be able to give them until they get back, but they show that they were thinking of their families, even if they couldn't actually communicate with them.
Right. Well, we are painting being at sea is quite a lot of suffering, and I suppose a lot of it was, but there's a reason for having ships at sea, and it is, as we've discussed, that the rest of society really needs the things that ships bring. We don't have to be dependent on them, but the way we've built our society, we are dependent on them. And yet these vital people and their ships are almost invisible. Branko, let's come to your second object, which I think is a seafarer's sticker. Let's have a look at that.
Yeah. We as a seafarers have other expression that actually you use at the beginning, but we said far from eyes, far from heart. That's what they actually, it's many times says to us, and we love the seafarers. It's something that is being recognized by others in the sense of the families and friends. However, most of the youngs, if I may say so, most of the youngs start their careers as looking for the adventure. But very soon, after a couple of shifts, they find out that this is not any longer any adventure. And one of the reasons, yes, the job is really, really tough. And that is one of the reasons that internet is a must for most of those youngs. Connectivity is most important part of it. So to see someone and to be a part of your real family, it's extremely important.
We should perhaps emphasize that this isn't a standard thing, because internet came along on land and it was in people's houses, and it was very easy for people to forget, I think, or just not know that it wasn't like that at sea, that even now you don't have the equivalent of fast internet on the ocean. You know, I've been on ships in the past 10 years where you had text-based email only, and that was it. And it's interesting because the cargo ships, I think, pushed hardest on getting technologies which could get that bandwidth to sea, precisely because of what you're saying, because it was so important. Seafarers wanted to talk to their families so much.
Unfortunately, I will have to a bit disagree with you. Why they put the internet on board the ships is a commercial reason, it's not to keep them seafarers with the connectivity with their own families. Even in discussions at the IMO, when we actually proposed that there was some kind of the reaction coming that it could actually change the security of the connectivity and then cyber attacks or something like that. But anyway, the seafarers are still, and many of them are without possibility to directly every day, or at least, I don't know, once in a week, connect with the families or do something. And for some of them, I have to say it's very expensive still. So they have to pay it in addition. So it's not free. Anyway, so yes.
Well, let's come back for a second to the issue of, you know, what COVID has done to so we've got these seafarers at sea, and as we discussed with Dennis, you know, there's a lot of feeling trapped here, and the ITF has been very active in talking to ship owners about what people should do about this, but you've also recommended that seafarers start not doing their work. Tell us a little bit about that and why it's happening.
I will have to go back in March, and acceptance for extension of the first, what the companies did, asked for extension of the ship certificates. Then the second, immediately after that, they actually asked for the seafarers to extend their certificates as well, which is a bit, I will say, a bit ridiculous. Why? Because most of the seafarers have never been engaged if their certificates are not valid at least for a couple of months more than the agreement says. So normally they already been in a problem. I mean, these seafarers, I'm talking about February or March. Then we actually accepted to be extended for a period of time. And then in June, 15th of June, we actually start a project called Enough is Enough. Because yes, we could say the seafarers could actually do their job properly or with the help, but it's showing that the others are not understanding that, and they are not willing to do something about to change the situation and to help the seafarers. Many of the governments actually didn't realize, and we work with the companies, but still we have a problem with the governments and the administration in regard to the many of the issues, like as I haven't said yet, but it's the question of the manning and additional tasks that the seafarers are doing. So it's not just a period of time on board the ships, but it's a much more burden that they are having now because of the reduced crews and many other things that are coming. So from 15 on June, we actually start a project of Enough is Enough. And I believe that the governments will have to understand that it's unsafe for the ship with the crew that has been double than normal. It doesn't matter how long. Is it 10, 15, or even 6 months? If the normal agreement is 3 months, then 3 months is extension of the existing agreement. So it's unacceptable to be done. So we actually saying that and in the meantime, as I mentioned already, they actually reduce the crews, giving those who stand on board the ships for a much longer period another task, sometimes the duties that they are not actually entitled to do so. So there are a lot of things that are actually a pressure and a burden to them.
So you're recommending, so do you think, it sounds as though there are many reasons why things do have to change, but do you see that happening? Do you see hope for people? I mean, are the companies and the government starting to listen? Presumably if seafarers stop working, then they have to listen, but is this, where are we in the battle? Is this the beginning or near the end?
The beginning actually started on 15th of June, but we will fight for that. We are actually succeed to open some of the borders for the seafarers to be a change, and we have a hubs for a crew change now in the world, and many of the ships are actually detoured to these ports just to, because also the ship owners recognize that it's unsafe for their ships and for their crews to spend that period of time and be fatigued and do the jobs that are not normally or regularly their jobs. So they're actually trying to find a solution as well. However, the only problem we still see is with the administration, and I think that they will probably understand that this is their task as well, to be a human with a human touch on that.
So we have to remember the humanity of those seafarers. Okay, let's move on to our final object, which Dennis can show us. So tell us about this.
So we spoke a bit about connectivity already. So one of the things we sell on board, back to the online shopper, onboard shopper, is that yes, we also get SIM cards. We sell them on board. I think a key bit of SIM cards is that it represents just that connectivity and that lifeline back home. And so we also carry with us sort of a MiFi. This is very kindly provided by the Rotterdam Port Welfare. MiFi is simply a portable router. If you like, you switch it on, and just like your router at home, it will have a username and a password. And so we provide that free of charge. This one is, you have a SIM card in it, and then about 10, 12 seafarers, if you're in the crew mess room, they can suddenly make use of a very high-speed internet. And so that can be great. And so suddenly everyone uses that to update their iPhones, their Android system to the latest, which they've all been postponing, go on YouTube, video phone with their family. And so it's lovely to see. It's absolute conversation killer. So if I feel there's a pastoral need there, don't switch it on, because all conversation will stop and everyone will be on their gadgets. But it's a great lifeline. Very grateful that we have those. And yeah, it's some of my other colleagues who are priests in other parishes, if you like, find it weird that as a priest I also sell SIM cards, but yeah, it sort of makes
multifunctional.
it makes for a more interesting business card, I guess. But no, but part of the reason is exactly that what it represents, it is something that will connect them to their loved ones back in India, back in the Philippines, back in Russia, back in the Ukraine. And so this is really key. I think you can go to a very dark place if you don't see or speak to your loved one like for a long time. And this is so key that they have the opportunity to do just that. So that's part of the reason why I carry some of these with me on board. And then sometimes there's quite a great demand for it, and at other times less.
Well, it's one of those interesting things, I think, going to see. So my experience of being away from internet is that it's getting more and more annoying, because what happens is if you don't log into some services for a month, they boot you out and you can't get back in. And like you say, your software hasn't updated, and then you can't fix that. And it's the entire world is designed around continuous connectivity.
Yes.
And it's actually really annoying when you're like one of a small number of people on the world. You're like, no, but it doesn't work for us. It's
yes,
really
and they all put their phones, they put roaming is off so that you don't use unnecessary data or your charges peak. Although sort of about 3 years ago, they've made that in Europe at least a lot easier, which is great, which is why some of these phone cards are brilliant, because you can actually leave your data and roaming on, and then it works in the Netherlands, in the UK, in France, in Hamburg, in Germany. And so that's fantastic like that. But I think, yes, like on my phone, when I'm on Wi-Fi here at home, it automatically updates the system when there's a new system. Seafarers all put it sort of a block on that because it eats up so much data that it will simply cost them too much. And so when I come along with a little device that suddenly enables them to update that, the smile on their face is massive. And suddenly they can video stream, which eats a lot of data. Data is very important, because it just means they also get that brief moment of feeling maybe a bit more human. Stuff you and I don't really think about. Yeah, we are on YouTube on our phone. Oh, we get to update this, and that's not really like it for them.
I just wanted to ask you just a little bit about what you think the future holds, because obviously there's the potential for quite a lot of mental health damage, if you sort of trap people in this situation. Do you hear that they're perhaps saying that, you know, when I go home, I'm not going to sea again? The risk is too great that this is going to happen again. What's the long term? Do they see themselves as seafarers so much that this is a part of their identity, and of course they'll get on the ship again? Or are they really questioning, you know, they might just walk away from all of this ridiculousness and do something else?
Yeah, so immediately a story comes to mind. I was contacted by a Filipino seafarer, second officer on board an oil tanker, about mid-March, who said I was supposed to be signed off after my 7-month contract on the 28th of December last year. And he contacted me in March, close to 10 months on board, saying, there's no reliever for me. This doesn't look like I'm going to be replaced anytime soon, able to go home. Can you please help me? And again, with help here from local ITF inspectors, I really tried to get him home. It was very frustrating. And only about a month ago, at the end of July, was he finally reunited with his wife and his 6-year-old daughter, having spent nearly 14 months on board. So double that. He was physically and mentally exhausted. I was genuinely worried at one point if he was going to hurt himself. And so we were nearly in daily contact. I was absolutely delighted when he finally made it home. This was becoming within our family. This was becoming a real thing to get him home. And so this was wonderful when he finally was able to get home. But to answer your question, one of the first things when I said to him, okay, so how long a break will you take? And he's actually keen to relearn as a primary school teacher, and says that this has left such big scars for him that he no longer wants to be a seafarer. And so that saddens me to hear that, but I find it fully understandable, because some of the things he must have gone through, and as second officer, you have considerable responsibilities. Some of his shifts for 14 months have been just, in my opinion, inhumane. And so
also, I guess the uncertainty. So, you know, it's bad enough if you know it's going to be like this, but if you know that it could randomly be extended, if your job could randomly change,
yes,
that's a lot to ask for anyone.
I think he's looking for more stability for him and his family. I know seafarers, especially from Philippines, India, can earn quite a bit more than in shore-based jobs in that country, and can earn more at sea. I fully appreciate that. I think he's made that decision, at least at this point in time, that although sort of, you know, the money side is good, it would be better. He feels he's missed so much. I've come across seafarers on board who've had 2 birthdays on board,
yeah,
and who've also missed 2 birthdays of their sons and daughters. And
well,
so
I love the idea that this guy has picked, of all the professions, that primary school teacher is about as far away from
absolutely,
but possibly get.
He has such love for his daughter. I could see it. We had a brief video call the other day, and it was lovely to see him reunited with his family. And it makes sense. Again, it saddens me that it's really come to this. And I also said to him, just take your time, be kind to yourself, because what has happened to you, and unfortunately is still happening to thousands of seafarers as we're speaking, this will leave scars. I think the mental health implications from what is going on and the pressure that's on these people is massive. And I'm fully also with ITF and saying stop working. And I understand that bit. I think what they're afraid of, though, which most companies will say doesn't happen, but blacklisting very much happens. When you put down arms, to put it like that, you stop working, you can end up on a list that not only the company won't employ you anymore, but no shipping company will touch you, and you're simply out of work.
Well, I think that's a very important point to finish on. We are out of time, so we're going to have to stop there, which I'm very sorry for. There's clearly some big important issues, but it's been great to shed some light on them today. Just before we finish, I have a very quick question for each of you, which is that if you had to be stranded at sea for a year, let's say one birthday, which ocean would you pick and what would you take with you? Hannah, you can go first.
Difficult one. I think I would have to maybe go for the Indian Ocean because I like the heat.
Nice and warm.
Yeah. And I think I would have to take, well, a phone and one of those SIM cards, because I think I would be one of those people who find that contacting home is very, very essential.
Well, I think that is a new thing for desert island castaways, isn't it? A SIM card. Branko, how about you? If you had to spend a year at sea, which ocean, with your experience, which ocean would you pick and what would you take with you?
I will go a bit further to the east and Hana, probably Pacific, some of the islands. But if I may choose, I will still decide on Mediterranean, which is not the ocean.
We'll let you have the Mediterranean Sea.
Pacific Ocean. Why I'm saying it? Because yes, the climate is the best in these areas. And yes, who will I or what will I take with me? Probably my wife.
Okay, we're humans around here. As long as she's happy to go.
You know, many seafarers actually, which are traditionally bring the wives on board the ships now. This is not a possibility at all, as well. So it's another issue for them as well.
Okay, and last but not least, Dennis.
Yes, I was thinking, I think we're mentioning nearly every ocean. I was thinking Atlantic and maybe hoping to drift off maybe near the Canary Islands or something. Seems like a good place to land. Also thinking of a SIM card for connection, but since that's been said, I'll bring a picture of my family along.
Brilliant. Fabulous. Thank you all very much. So much in this topic. It's been great to talk about it. We will be back next week for our last episode of this series, which will be about hidden nature. Do get in touch with us, Facebook, Instagram or Twitter. Look for Royal Museums Greenwich. And all the sites of the Royal Museums Greenwich are now open. So the National Maritime Museum is the last one. Entry is still free. You just need to book ahead. So if you want to come along and see all these amazing things in person, apart from possibly Dennis's deodorant, you can go to the website rmg.co.uk/welcomeback and visit in person. So it only remains for me to thank our three fabulous contributors, Hannah Stockton, Branko Bolan and the Reverend Dennis Woodward. Thank you to Simon Kane for the readings, to Steve Thompson for the music. Sean was the producer this week, and I'm Helen Czerski, and I'll see you next week.